Okay, let's get started. Good morning to all of you who have joined us this morning. I am Dr. Jason Bolton, Vice President of Community Partnerships and Admissions for the Help Group. I'll be moderating today's webcast titled The Intersection Between Autism Spectrum Disorder and LGBTQIA+. Since last August, many of you may know that we have offered a series of webcasts that have covered distance learning during the closure of school, how parents can help their students at home, finding perspective amid all the chaos, social skills, the mental health impact of the pandemic on our youth, making proper use of neuropsychological assessments, and a couple more. You can find all of those webcasts as well as a couple of different virtual open houses of all of our schools on our website at www.thehelpgroup.org. A few years ago, the Help Group recognized a trend of young people presenting to our programs with autism spectrum disorders who were also identifying as LGBTQIA+. As is our mission, we mobilized to create programming that would meet the unique needs of this population. And out of that work, our Kaleidoscope program was born. A significant interest of the Kaleidoscope program quickly emerged, and we gathered today to discuss just that, the intersectionality of ASD and LGBTQIA+. At this time, I would like to introduce our panelists today who will lead us in this important discussion, Drs. Laurie Stevens and Sarah Bruce. They're waving to you. Dr. Laurie Stevens is a developmental psychologist who has been working with children, teen, and young adults on the autism spectrum for over 25 years. She currently serves as the Help Group's Senior Director of Autism and LGBTQ+ programs. Previously, Dr. Stevens served as the Director of Autism Spectrum Disorder programs at the Help Group. Her primary area of specialty is in designing social skills curricula with a newfound passion for the changing nature of social expectations in the digital age. She has designed, run, and supervised social skills groups for children ages 2 years through young adulthood. She has provided individual, family, and parent psychotherapy, utilizing primarily a cognitive behavioral approach to a wide range of clients. While working with her ASD clients, Dr. Stevens became extremely interested in the overlap between transgender and genderqueer identifications and folks on the spectrum, as many of her clients begin to share their authentic selves to her. Dr. Stevens oversees all of Kaleidoscope's programming and events and has been instrumental in establishing a specialized diagnostic clinic for LGBTQ+ children, teens, and young adults who may suspect that they have an autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Sarah Bruce is currently serving as a postdoctoral fellow specializing in working with autistic individuals at the Help Group. She earned her master's degree and doctorate in clinical psychology from the PGSP Stanford PsyD Consortium and developed expertise in the treatment and assessment of autistic individuals at the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She also sought out training experiences that supported her clinical interests, working with children and adolescent populations, young adult adjustment concerns, and concerns related to LGBTQIA+ identities at various community mental health centers in the Bay Area. Dr. Bruce recently completed her clinical internship at a community mental health agency in the Bay Area, where she pursued her interest in the intersection of various cultural identities and LGBTQIA+ status, and developed the agency's first clinical program for youth who identified as LGBTQIA+. Now that you've heard a bit about our presenters, as has been our tradition in these webcasts, we would like to know a little bit about you too. You should now see a short poll pop up on your screen. Please answer the questions. I'll give you a few minutes, less than that. I'll give you a minute to get through these 4 questions so that we know a little bit about you. And a little hint here, when you're finished with the poll and you've submitted your answers, you'll have to click the X on the top right corner to get this off the screen, or else you won't be able to see our pretty faces. And you guys are quick. Thank you. Got about 70% answered already. And by the way, thank you guys for your interest in this topic. We had overwhelming interest in this topic, and we're blown away by the response. We're approaching 90%, which is usually my benchmark. So, all right, there's a lot of new people here, so it's good. I'm going to describe a little bit about what the help group does here in a minute. So some of you will not have heard it for the 9th time, but also thank you very much to about a quarter of you who have come to our any of our prior webcasts. We appreciate that. There are a good number of teachers and mental health providers here. A good number of parents here as well. And, you know, the other category is always a big one. Can't describe everything. We really appreciate all of you coming today. There's a few who identify as autistic, and a good percent in the LGBTQ community are here, as we expected. Thank you so much. And as we also expected, there are some folks here who identify with this topic of intersectionality. So that's fantastic. And let's see what you guys think you already know. So that's great. And my favorite folks are the folks who answer, you should have invited me to be on the panel. So we will see who you are and see if we can get you next time. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Don't forget to click off the box on the top right-hand corner so that it gets off your screen. Okay. We are honored that you have chosen to spend another hour with us. For those of you joining us for the first time, as we just found out, there are about 73% of you who are. Let me tell you a tiniest bit about the help group. Among our other social and mental health services, the help group operates 15 non-public schools in Los Angeles County for students with autism spectrum disorders, learning disabilities, ADHD, developmental delays, and emotional challenges. We contract with more than 80 local education authorities to provide special education and related services to more than 1,100 students. In addition to that and our mental health services, you are going to be hearing a lot today about our specialized program that we call Kaleidoscope. During the presentation, as some of you have already figured out, you may use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to present questions you would like the panelists to address. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webcast, and we'll attempt to answer as many of these questions as we can. But from doing this a few times, we know that we will not be able to get to all of your questions. So we will follow up with an email to all registrants that answers some of the questions that we were not able to address today. All right, you've heard enough from me. I now have the great pleasure of introducing our first panelist, Dr. Laurie Stevens.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Bolton. Erica, if you could go ahead to move, there we go. So Dr. Bruce and I always like to start our talks out with a little bit of a language disclaimer. We are certainly aware and we understand and acknowledge the impact that words and phrases have on people, but both within the autistic community and the LGBTQIA community, preferred phrases, words that are used to describe certain things are kind of ever-changing and evolving. And of course, we do our best to always stay up to date with preferred language, but every once in a while, we might make a mistake or we might not be aware of a new terminology or a way to describe something. And we, of course, intend absolutely no harm or degradation with the phrases that we use. I particularly like to listen to my clients since the majority of my clients are an overlapping between autism and some identity along the LGBTQIA spectrum. I like to listen to them and try to find, when I present, common ground between what my clients have asked to be referred by or through. And throughout this presentation, we will also be using they and them as a singular non-gendered pronoun. So we will never assume gender nor refer to gender as a binary, as in just male or female. So we will be using they, them. And I just want to mention a little bit about the change of language within the ASD community. So there's two different ways to kind of refer to people, which is person first language. So that is, you would say they are a person with autism. So the person comes first. And then the opposite to that is using identity first language, which is to say they are an autistic person. And I was raised, to use a colloquial phrase, with person first identity. We were always taught you always use, because people are a person first, so you use person first language. And the majority of my clients and the majority of the autistic community has been able to vocalize that they really do prefer identity first language. So I do my best to try and use identity first language, but I might make a couple of mistakes. I usually catch myself, but I do apologize in advance because I'm working to change 25 years of saying something one way to another. But also within my scope of practice of the clients that I see through Kaleidoscope and everything, there's a fully universal agreement as to how they would like to be referred in terms of a person with autism or an autistic person. But I'm going to try to use my identity first language. So if we could go on to the next slide. So let's just do a really quick overview as to what is autism. What are we really talking about? So autism is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects people primarily in three ways. So that is, there's challenges in social interaction and thinking skills. That doesn't mean cognitive skills. It means how you think, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit more in a minute and how that might affect certain things related to gender identity. Communication skills oftentimes are also a challenge. So within the autistic population, we have people who aren't able to use spoken language as a way to communicate, all the way through very verbose individuals who might not necessarily understand the pragmatic nuances of conversation and certain things in terms of language skills, but they're fully able to express their thoughts, feelings, and needs. This population also all tend to have rigid, repetitive behaviors or an over-focus in certain interests. So they might prefer to always drink out of a green cup or something. They might really be very interested in fans, overhead fans, and want to talk about that primarily. And so they can have very limited focuses. And then the majority of the population do present with some type of sensory issues. So that can be an oversensitivity to sounds. It can be an oversensitivity to crowds, to smells, to texture. So they don't like to wear a certain type of clothing, can't tolerate certain types of weather and things like that. So it's sort of this combination of all of these deficits or differences need to be present in order to get a diagnosis of autism. Within the autistic population, there's a very wide range of skill strength and deficit. So there's not like an intellectual protocol or profile that fits for all autistic people. So usually they have strengths in some areas and weaknesses in some other areas. And it is important to state that autistic traits are found in everyone. So as we're talking about this, if you think, oh, well, I've never liked the tags in my clothing either, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are autistic. You need to have the full picture. And you need to have the social communication difficulties, the rigid behavioral and the limited behavioral repertoire in order to have the diagnosis. But certainly these are all variations of things that all of us possess, whether you are autistic or you do not identify as autistic. And in terms of the prevalence, the most recent prevalence out of the CDC says that about 1 in every 54 children is diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. So thank you. And a lot of times people kind of conceptualize autism as like this sort of linear functioning level where you can be less autistic and then you move along and you have more and more and more symptoms and then you end up being more autistic. So that used to be, we used to use phrases like low functioning autistic and high functioning autistic. And these phrases don't really make any sense because autism isn't a linear thing. It's what it really looks like is there's a bunch of strengths and weaknesses that are all intersecting and interacting. So you can have an autistic person who actually has very good language and can really express themselves clearly, carry out a conversation, but they might have very impacted daily living skills or executive functioning skills. And they might have mild sensory difficulties and challenges, and they might have a lot of motor difficulties. It might be very hard for them to write. They may have never learned to ride a bike. They may appear to be clumsy. And so the profile needs to be thought of more in a 3D arena where you can have strengths and weaknesses that are constantly interacting and are movable. So there's no such thing as a high functioning individual, because even somebody who might have 130 IQ, let's say, so people would think, well, that's a high functioning autistic person, might have a lot of delays in terms of their daily living skills. They might not be able to use a stove. They might always forget to look both ways before crossing the street. So if we referred to them as just high functioning, we would be denying them the services and the acknowledgement of the areas that give them challenge and that they might need help and support in. So this is why we don't want to think of autism as just this continuum of a spectrum, but we want to think of it more as this 3D kind of model. So I want to make sure that as I'm talking, people understand that and know that I don't use the phrases high functioning and low functioning. Okay, so talking about LGBTQIA, I think that it's really good. We have a training that we do through Kaleidoscope that we call To the Letter that really does kind of explain that there's LGBTQ, there's LGBT, and then there's LGBTQ, and then there's LGBTQIA, and then there's the plus. And so what does all this mean? And I think most people know that the LGBT stands for lesbian, so typically defining women who are attracted to other women. Gay, which typically refers to males who are attracted to other males. However, there are lesbians who prefer to refer to themselves as gay. So gay does not necessarily imply a gender. Bisexual, who are people who are attracted to both males and females. Transgender are people who identify with a gender that is different than the one that they were assigned at birth. But then I think where people start to get like, what does that stand for, is the Q. And the Q kind of has two meanings. It stands for queer, which is a phrase that used to be kind of considered a derogatory term to refer to somebody as queer. But the LGBTQIA community, several of them have kind of readopted this phrase queer, which sort of implies that, you're not of the typical LGBTQIA type of presentation, but you may or may not identify with any specific LGBT letter. And then questioning is for people who just aren't sure. I'm still questioning my gender. I'm still questioning my sexual identity. And so it's not always a clear-cut thing for people. And so the Q is there to stand for those two things. The I stands for intersex, and intersex refers to people who may have biological presentations of both genders. So, for instance, there are people who might be born with XXY chromosomes and have different types of different chromosomal presentations so that they might have mixed genitalia when they're born. This is a population that in the past, when they were born, parents were told that they sort of needed to pick a gender for their child. And oftentimes corrective surgery was provided without letting the person be able to pick and identify themselves with what their gender is. It was kind of forced upon them. And that is no longer happening. But that's what the I stands for, is intersex. And then the A also has a double meaning, which can stand for asexual. or ACE, and that refers to people who are not necessarily interested at all in a type of sexual or physical relationship with other people. And it can also stand for aromantic, which oftentimes also is called aro, which can refer to people who aren't interested in having a romantic relationship, though they might be interested in a sexual relationship. And then the plus allows for the fact that there's all types of other identifications that people can have. And so it's not just this sort of colorful column over there. People can identify in a variety of different ways. So the plus is there to let people identify however they want. So they can pick a terminology that resonates most with them, and we're not, or there's no set box that they have to fit into. You might hear us use the term cisgender today, and cisgender implies to people who identify as the gender that they were assigned at birth. So, for instance, when I was born, my parents were told that I was a girl, a female, and I identify as female. So I'm what's considered cisgendered. Pansexual is a phrase that refers to people who are attracted either romantically or sexually to anybody, so anybody within the LGBTQIA or the cisgender heterosexual community. Non-binary, it applies to people who do not identify with this set gender structure of you are either male or female. So these are people who can move within gender. So I worked with a client who said that some days they just felt male and would identify and present more as male, and other days they felt female and would identify as female. And there are other people who just identify as being neither male nor female, so they refer to themselves as non-binary. And then there's phrases like gender queer, gender nonconforming, gender fluid. And all of these, again, apply to people for whom their gender identity or gender expression is different than what they may have been assigned at birth, or that they don't have one particular gender identity. So gender fluid would imply to people, again, sort of like non-binary. Those two words could at times be interchangeable, who might say, again, sometimes I'm female, sometimes I'm male, and it's able to be fluid.
And just to add on to what Dr. Stevens was saying, bisexual can mean attracted to males and females, and it can also mean attracted to the same and different genders, or attracted to more than one gender. So some of these words have multiple definitions, and we recognize that that different people may define these in different ways.
Thanks, Sarah. Go ahead. Oh, okay, great. So a little bit more on gender nonconformity, because the majority of the work on the overlap with autism and LGBTQIA identity has really focused a lot on gender nonconformity. So this is really an umbrella term that describes any expression of gender that is considered to be incongruent with stereotyped gender norms of the binary. So that is stereotyped male presentations or expectations, and stereotyped females. So this can be related to identity. So whether, again, you are assigned male at birth but identify as a female, but it can also have to do with interests, right? So there's been this thought that males are supposed to be interested in certain things and females are supposed to be interested in certain things. And so if you have a little boy who is interested in playing with dolls, then that's oftentimes considered to be gender nonconformity, because boys don't play with dolls, which of course isn't true, and is something that society decided, but that would be considered something that would be gender nonconforming. The same thing goes with appearance. So again, I've had very young clients as young as 3 or 4, who wanted to dress in what would be considered the stereotypical or the expected clothing of the opposite gender. So again, boys who want to wear dresses is still considered to be unexpected, and not considered to fit within what we expect how somebody would present their gender. even as young children and certainly as adults. And then finally, behavior. So with behavior, this is like the cadence of your voice, how you walk, and how you might act or react to certain situations. Again, we have this sort of notion that women act one way and men act another way. And so if you act a way that doesn't align with this stereotyped view of gender, then you could be considered to be gender nonconforming. And when we talk about the research in a minute, the research also, they use gender nonconforming to refer to people who might be transgender, who present with gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is when you're experiencing a lot of anxiety, upset, stress over the gender that you were assigned at birth because it does not align with what you authentically feel you are. And that can produce a significant amount of dysphoria. It can refer to people who are presenting as non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. So this gender nonconformity term is very large. However, researchers are starting to use the phrase gender diverse so as to better align with the concept of neurodiverse, which neurodiverse is the phrase that we use a lot of time to refer to the sort of broader autistic spectrum and also to other people who just have variations in their cognitive style. So people with autism or autistic people are considered to be neurodiverse, as are, let's say, people with ADHD. So it aligns a little bit better when we refer to them as gender diverse. And so that tends to be how the phrase that I use. And hopefully we'll start to see the research kind of all coming together so it's easier to understand by using some of these common phrases. So what do we know about the overlap? Because again, and I noticed that a couple of people have made comments in the chat about, and when people were signing up, they kind of said, you know, I've noticed this in my practice. So I see autistic clients and I've noticed this increase in LGBTQIA identity, or the opposite. I work with the LGBTQIA community and I've noticed that a lot of them have been diagnosed or suspect that they might have an autism spectrum disorder. So what's very interesting is that the data on the general population for LGBTQIA identity is that about 4 to 5% identify as somewhere on the LGBTQIA spectrum. But when we look at the autistic population, and this is all on self-reports, so older teens and young adults, about 70% of the autistic population identify as non-heterosexual. So nothing specific in terms of LGBTQIA, one of those letters, but just identify as non-heterosexual. So there's a huge difference there. And of course, we know that within the general population, that 4 to 5% is probably an underrepresentation because everybody is not comfortable yet to identify as LGBTQIA for a variety of reasons. And so while I suspect that way more than 4 to 5% are truly LGBTQIA, I don't think that it would reach anywhere near the 70% that we see in the autistic population. And when we look at gender diversity, the research has been pretty consistent that about a quarter of the autistic population, so about 25% of gender diverse folks are autistic. So that, again, is a very high percentage. And we've seen that. So, for instance, this summer we ran a camp for autistic teens, and about 25% of each cohort of our campers identified also as LGBTQIA, mostly as non-binary or transgender. So the research shows that, and I think our data, just from the groups that we run and the folk that we work with, we see that 25% pretty well represented. When we look at the gender diverse population in and of itself, we find out that about 15% of autistic adults identify with the opposite gender than was assigned at birth, compared again to just about 3 to 5% of the general population. So again, a very significant population. And then in 2018, there was a study done of transgender teens and young adults, and they found that 22% of those had a clinical diagnosis of autism, and that was compared to only 2.5% of the general population that had that diagnosis. And so what this means is we know that particularly within the gender diverse, but also within the broader LGBTQIA community, this is a community that definitely has what we refer to as double minority status. So they're coming from two underrepresented populations and two devalued populations. So that's something that when we're looking at treatment, we really want to keep that in mind, that double minority status. And then finally, just a little bit on diagnosis and symptoms. So we know that the cisgendered males and females are diagnosed earlier with autism. So the average age for a cisgendered child to be diagnosed with autism is about 5 to 6 years of age. But when we look at the gender diverse population, the average age of diagnosis is much later. It's not until about 14 years of age. So that lets us know that something's not being picked up within the gender diverse population yet, that clinicians aren't aware of looking for autism within that gender diverse population, and really being sure that you're teasing this out with all of your gender diverse clients so that we can get that autism diagnosis as early as possible. And then some very recent 2021 data has shown that within the transgender community, that when you have people who have transitioned from male to female, they actually show a higher concern for ASD. So whether that's their family or themselves believing that they might have autism. And then in the male to female population, they had an earlier presentation of autistic symptoms. And what this kind of lets us know is this sort of aligns with the cisgendered male-female population. So that lets us know that the transitioning population, so transitioned males, align with cisgendered males in terms of when their concerns start to develop, and the same thing with transition females. So this is one of the first studies that's kind of looking at whether the transgender and neurodiverse population, whether they do align, whether that's neurofunctionally kind of, and how when their symptoms present and how their symptoms present with what we were traditionally thinking was male and female. And it looks like from very beginning research that might be happening. So lots more research needs to be done on that, but that's kind of an exciting finding. Go ahead. Thanks. So why is there this overlap? And I'm going to cut to the end before I talk a little bit about this. But the long and the short of it is we really don't know. It's really unclear, and it's difficult research to do because we know that there's a lot of the non-autistic population who probably is not willing to come out and is not willing to participate in a research study and everything. So it limits our ability to really look at why this overlap exists. But there's a couple of theories out there. There's theories that are related to, let's say, the prenatal exposure to sex steroid hormones. Don't know why I can't say that. So that's something that, there's these thoughts that people with autism tend to have more testosterone and more exposure to testosterone. And then maybe within the LGBTQ community, there's exposure to certain hormones that lead them to, let's say, present as a different gender or align with a different gender or have a different sexual orientation. There's also this theory about the extreme male brain, which I won't get into too much right now, but this is the concept that males tend to be systemizers and females tend to be empathizers. And that when you look at the autistic population, that they tend to align mostly as systematizers. So even females who are autistic tend to align more as systemizers. But this research is a little bit tricky, and it doesn't look at or didn't include anybody who was gender diverse. So whether that would hold up in looking at a gender diverse population is unclear. There's thoughts that the symptoms overlap, and that it's just kind of like one spectrum all the way around. There's some cognitive theories about how people think, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in 1 second. But then there's this notion of theory of mind. And theory of mind is one of the interesting things for me because it's one of the only ones that I think there's some good research to support, though there's nothing that's great in terms of the research to really explain why this happens. But Erica, if you could just go to the next slide. So theory of mind, in a nutshell, is really our ability to kind of think about the fact that other people think. And other people have their own thoughts, their own views. They see things from a different perspective. They've had different experiences. They don't think like us. We know that. We might want them to think like us, but we know that they don't. And so we're able to take another person's perspective. We can really think about, we can think about somebody or looking at something else and know, oh, that, like in this little cartoon, the man's looking at the girl who's looking at the cat, and the cat's looking at the girl. So the man knows the girl's thinking about the cat and the cat's thinking about the girl, and we're able to do this type of thinking. And this is something that's been found to be a challenge for a lot of autistic people. So again, not every autistic person, but for a lot of autistic people, theory of mind has been challenging. And so there's been some recent research. So there were studies done in 2020 and then again published this year that looked at the overlap between gender dysphoric feelings. So how kind of distressing was it for somebody's to identify with their assigned at birth gender compared to how they felt, how they presented self-report with autistic traits, and their theory of mind. And they measured theory of mind by looking at people's ability to sort of read eyes and how somebody is feeling just by being able to see, this much of their eyes. And what they found is that autistic traits were highly associated with gender dysphoric feelings. So the more ASD traits that somebody presented with, the higher their gender dysphoria was also rated. So there seemed to be this overlap. And then when we added in the theory of mind, it was discovered that the weaker the theory of mind skills were, the higher the autistic traits and the higher the gender dysphoria. So there does seem to be something about this theory of mind challenge or deficit that might be, it wouldn't really fully explain the overlap. But it's something that appears to have some type of a predictive factor, or at least an influential factor in this overlap. So if you could just go to the next slide. And so one of the things that we know, and one of the things that my clients have been telling me for years, is that they're just not as influenced, autistic people are just not as influenced by cultural or social norms, right? That idea of, well, I want to be just like everybody else, that's not who they are, and that's not who they want to be. So they're really not looking around and saying, oh, okay, well, wait a minute. I was told when I was young that I'm a male and therefore I need to like sports and I need to do this and I need to do that. They're not necessarily thinking that way. They're just going to be themselves. So they're not as focused on how well they're going to be accepted by society. They might be less influenced by societal norms and might present their internal states much more authentically. I am who I am. This is who I am. And so they may be more open about like a bisexuality or an asexuality or a gender difference than other people would be, because they're just not as bound by those rules. So I know that John Strang, who's done a lot of the research in this overlap, has really talked about how it really might be that autistic people are the most authentic people out there because they're not as influenced. And so their authenticity is a lot of non-binary or gender fluid, gender queer, gender diverse, and that might really be what a lot of people are if they weren't bound by feeling like I need to fit in and I need to follow society's norms and this is unexpected behavior. But there's a couple of other things that we want to keep in mind when we're looking at this overlap. So I mentioned before that people on the spectrum oftentimes have rigid thinking, and we have seen this too. So sometimes clients, when they're questioning, will bring things up like they might say, you know what, I know that boys like girls and I like a girl, so then I must be a boy. And sometimes we have to work with our clients to be able to get them to understand, well, what does that mean that you like a girl? And how do you like that girl, and how do you really identify, without telling them, yes, you are gay, yes, you are, bisexual, but letting them explore that to understand that just because you like a girl doesn't necessarily mean that you're a boy, because girls can like girls too. And then we've also, so for instance, I had a particular experience with one client who did have a same-sex encounter, and then just kept saying, well, I guess I'm gay because I did this. And we spent a lot of time in therapy really talking about, well, what does that mean? And how do you generally feel? And how do you want to identify? Like, what phrase? And maybe there is no phrase that identifies you. So a lot of times you want to be thinking about that rigid thinking when you're working with clients, or if you're a parent and you're addressing this, and really help the clients think through all of this without us putting any judgment or making any decision for them, allowing them to come to their own decision. And then the other thing is that there's an overlap oftentimes in certain sensory sensitivities. So for instance, clients might not be able to tolerate certain fabrics, or they might not like anything binding. So again, I've had clients who have said, I like to wear dresses because they're flowing. And this is how I want to present myself because this is how it feels good, but I don't identify as a girl. I just like to wear dresses, but that doesn't make me a girl. And they're absolutely right. It does not make them a girl just because they wear dresses. And the same thing with, some people can't tolerate the feel of hair on their neck, or it actually physically hurts them to get a haircut. So for many people who are neurotypical, you'll think, well, I don't understand, it doesn't hurt at all. But for people who have really high sensory sensitivity, it can. So a male might prefer to have long hair, but again, doesn't necessarily identify as a female, and may or may not understand why people would say, oh, I thought you were a woman, because they saw them from behind with really long hair or something like that. So there's a lot of psychoeducation that needs to go on, and a lot of awareness that people need to have about what are some of these overlapping symptoms. And then the last thing that I want to be able to say is I really want everybody to keep in mind that all people with autism, no matter where you are within that 3D plane, can be represented within the LGBTQIA community. So, here at the Help Group, we work with kids with all levels of functioning. And, there are people who might not be able to express themselves verbally. So males who might want to carry a purse. And sometimes we overhear people saying, oh, no, you're a boy. That's for women. Put that down. And we don't ever want to do that. We don't ever want to assume that just because somebody might have an intellectual disability or can't express themselves verbally, that means that they can't be LGBTQIA, because of course they can. So we always want to be sure that we are validating and accepting and letting people do it. If your clients want to carry a purse, let them carry a purse. Let them be who they are and be authentic, and don't make assumptions that a cognitive ability is also related to sexual orientation or gender identity, because it's not. And I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Bruce, who's going to talk to you about some affirming supports that you can use.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. So as was just mentioned, I'm Dr. Sarah Bruce, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll be spending the next few minutes discussing strategies for supporting LGBTQIA+ autistic youth. So research on LGBTQIA+ youth shows us that it's not enough to be simply tolerant of a youth's identity to foster positive outcomes among this population. Rather, we need to be actively affirming and show them through our words and actions that they are valued. So first, it's crucial to listen without judgment. Giving an LGBTQIA+ autistic youth your undivided attention, letting them speak without interrupting, and validating how they're feeling can go a long way in building trust and affirming support. They may not want to talk to you right away, and just letting them know that you are there to listen when they're ready can be really supportive. Next, it can be helpful to ask an LGBTQIA+ autistic youth what they need. They may not have an answer, but just asking can be a great way to show you care. Being curious about an LGBTQIA plus autistic youth's identity, pronouns, and life experiences can be a great way to express care and support. And also recognizing that they may not be ready to share this information, but you're open to the information when they are ready to share. Next, letting them know they have a bright future ahead of them is very important. Many have been told directly or have learned through media portrayals of both LGBTQIA plus and autistic people that they will always struggle, will never find love, will never be happy, or that their life will end in tragedy. So let them know they're valued just as they are and can lead a happy and fulfilling life. Finally, it's important to help them make social connections within safe and supportive communities. It can be hard for LGBTQIA plus autistic youth to find appropriate peer groups, as many feel that they're not accepted in communities that are geared solely toward LGBTQIA plus people or solely autistic people. Sometimes finding an accepting community takes some creativity. You might consider steering them toward a program like Kaleidoscope that specializes in supporting LGBTQIA plus autistic youth, or finding a group based on an area of interest where they feel like they can be themselves. Next slide. Now I'd like to transition to discussing language. The words we use to describe and address LGBTQIA plus autistic youth carry great power, and it's essential that we choose our words carefully to show respect and affirming support. First, it's important to avoid making assumptions and follow the other person's lead when determining how to refer to them. When I'm first meeting a new client, I often introduce myself with my pronouns to help them feel comfortable telling me which pronouns I should use to refer to them. If they do not immediately respond with their pronouns, I will ask them a question like, "How should I refer to you?" or "What are your pronouns?" When a person tells you which pronouns or words to use to refer to them, those are the words you should use. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves on the most up-to-date and respectful terminology to use to refer to others. So on this slide, you'll see that as Dr. Stevens mentioned, we talked about using identity first language for autistic individuals. That seems to be a broad preference among this population, and avoiding some of those other terms. And similarly for LGBTQIA plus identities, we want to use affirming words. So someone who's trans or transgender would not want to be called some of those other terms that are listed here on this slide. Next. When addressing groups of people, consider who they are and what level of formality is appropriate. Using gendered language to address larger groups of people can immediately signal to someone who is trans or non-binary that they are not welcome in the space. Switching out gendered language for a non-gendered alternative, such as using you all instead of you guys, is an easy way to ensure that everyone feels safe and comfortable. Next slide. Using correct pronouns can be difficult, and all of us make mistakes sometimes. The best way to respond if you make a mistake and accidentally misgender someone is to apologize, quickly correct your mistake, and continue speaking. It can be painful to be misgendered, so it is reasonable to make an apology. However, it can feel uncomfortable for someone who has just been misgendered to have to console you. So it is best to keep your apology short and sweet. Next slide. For example, Alex rides her bike to work. Keep it brief and keep going. Also, if someone corrects you, they're helping you learn. It is a nice gesture to say thank you if you've been corrected. Next slide. Here are some affirming phrases that you can use to show an LGBTQIA plus autistic person that you care about them. Things like, "You're fine just as you are, you're not alone, you're special and you belong." Next slide. Sorry, I'm zooming through. I just want to make sure we have some time for questions. All right. So finally, let's discuss some ways you can help create safe spaces for LGBTQIA plus autistic youth. First, it is important to support clubs and extracurriculars that provide a safe space for LGBTQIA plus autistic youth. If these types of safe spaces do not exist in your community, you could consider starting one. So things like a GSA or a special interest group, an anime group, or just a place where kids can be themselves and try out different gender roles if they want to. It can be beneficial to post signs, stickers, or other symbols around the environment that signal that you are someone safe to talk to. So the Safe Zone sticker on this slide is an example of an easy way to help an LGBTQIA plus autistic person feel more comfortable in your classroom or office. As you can see, even when I am Zooming, I always make sure I have a rainbow flag somewhere in my background. so my clients know that I am a safe person to talk to. Next, taking into account the sensory needs of LGBTQIA+ autistic people can be a helpful way to remove barriers to socialization and promote access to support. A sensory safe space may be a quiet room with dim lights, or a space at a Pride event where people are asked to speak quietly. So making special spaces that are sensory safe for autistic people is really important in helping them be included in the LGBTQIA+ community. Many people have not been trained on how to support LGBTQIA+ autistic youth, so it can be helpful to model for school personnel and adults in positions of power what this affirming support might look like. And finally, making sure that laws, policies, and practices that discriminate against LGBTQIA+ autistic people are not in place is extremely important. Continued advocacy for this population is essential for ensuring positive outcomes. Similarly, if you witness harassment or bullying against LGBTQIA+ autistic youth, stand up for them. This happens very often, and if you are standing by and not intervening, that can be perceived similarly to condoning what's happening. So actually stepping in and putting policies in place for handling harassment and bullying is extremely important. So I hope you're able to carry some of these affirming practices into your daily life to support LGBTQIA+ autistic youth, and I greatly appreciate your attention. I'll now hand it back over to Dr. Bolton for Q&A.
You're muted.
I was muted. We've only been doing these Zooms for a year and a half, so it's hard to get the hang of things. Thank you, Dr. Bruce and Dr. Stevens. I think we probably need to have another one of these in a couple of months and be able to talk about this. It's been such an important topic, and people are you can tell by the chat that people are so invested in this topic. So we will definitely do that. There are a number of questions. People submitted them throughout the presentation. I did just put up that we might go about 5 minutes long. So anybody who can stay, we appreciate that. We understand if you can't. And also remember that this webcast will be posted in its entirety on our website a few days after we're done. Maybe even today. We'll let you know when it's posted, and the rest of them are there too. I do want to try to get to a few questions, so that's why we might go over a little bit. Before we do that, Dr. Stevens, very briefly, we've talked about Kaleidoscope a few times. So can you just tell us a little bit about what our program is, Kaleidoscope, so that folks can access that if they need to, and just learn a little bit more about what we're doing. But be brief.
Yes, I will be really brief. So, and I'll talk really fast. Kaleidoscope is a program that's specifically designed for LGBTQ youth and young adults. We see people of all ages, so there's no young age. So we'll see people 2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter. We provide individual therapy, group therapy, family therapy. We do parent support groups. We do parent support groups for people who have LGBTQIA children, and also a specialized parent support group for those who have an autistic LGBTQIA child that's actually run by the brilliant Dr. Bruce. And then we have free social groups. So we have all different types of social activities that we do online and in person. We have a party on Saturday, if anybody's interested, for teens in person. And you can access our website, which is right up here, if you want to do that. We also have a specialty diagnostic clinic. So we do autism diagnoses for people on the LGBTQIA within that community who think that they might have an autism spectrum disorder. And we do public speaking. And I think, am I leaving anything out, Sarah? What else do we do? I think that's it.
Yeah.
Oh, you think we've covered it? Okay. So there are a couple, we had some questions from people when people registered that I had queued up to ask, but I think we have at least a couple questions that I think are important for us to treat here before we get off. So let me start. I'm just going to read these verbatim for how they showed up in the chat. So this one says, And this can be for you, Laurie, Sarah, whoever wants to take it. It says, my child identifies as a cisgendered male, but presents as gender nonconforming. How do I help him understand why people think he's a girl? It used to stress him out, but even when he tried to present male, the mistake still happened. So he eventually gave up and presents how he feels instead of how he thinks he should. He's 9, and I can still see the stress on his face every time he's misgendered.
Do you want me to take it, Sarah, or you want to take it?
You can take it first. Yeah, go ahead and take it first.
So I'm not sure if the child also is autistic, but we've had this discussion a lot about misgendering within Kaleidoscope and what to do about it. So I think it is important, like Sarah was saying in her talk, to just really have some very open conversations, you probably are, with your son, and let them know maybe a little bit, again, like that theory of mind concept, that this might be why other people do, and maybe your son can have something that says back, like, boys can dress this way too. It doesn't matter how I dress. If you want to know if I'm a boy or a girl, ask me. And so give them some ways to respond to help reduce the stress, but also explore that stress and what it means and what misgendering means to him. And I think continuing to validate that your son at 9 is strong enough to continue to present how they want to is really fantastic and something that should be celebrated. And he's doing it through the stress. And it's something that if you really feel like they're getting anxious and really stressed out, you might want to seek out some therapy to help your son be able to adjust a little bit better.
And we do offer therapy geared toward LGBTQIA plus autistic youth at Kaleidoscope, which is terrific. And I also just want to reflect that this can be very stressful for parents. And it's something that I hear often in the parent group that I'm currently running. It can be hard for parents and hard for kids to go through sort of this gender identity exploration phase. And we're not sure, why kids are, trying on a lot of different hats, and it can just be really overwhelming for parents, and just kind of hanging in there and trying your best to use the language and pronouns that your child has requested and be there for them if they want to talk about it. Those are really key ways to support your child as well.
Thank you. I thought that was an important question for us to address. And here's one more. There's a little overlap, but I think it's also important that we talk. And both of these questions represent children who are very young. So this one says, if a second grade student with autism continually changes their name and gender identity multiple times during the school year, how do you recommend handling that? What about addressing these continual changes with their classmates who are curious and ask a lot of questions?
So this is a great question. I partially answered it in the chat. Trying to go with the flow and use the language and pronouns that the child has requested. It can be difficult and mistakes can happen, but kind of moving with it and being as flexible as possible can be helpful. As far as other kids who are asking questions, I think answering kids' questions and allowing them to ask these questions can be helpful so that they can learn, and modeling for those kids how to ask the questions and what language they should use is really important, because they're still learning how to understand this topic as well. So modeling can be important there. Dr. Stevens, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, because I did see your response in the chat too. So I think there's something also oftentimes within certain aspects or certain portions of the autistic population where they go through identity changes unrelated to LGBTQIA issues. So, I've had clients who decide that they want to be called Casper, they want to change their names, and are our advice is always to go with it and to just be like, okay, today you're Casper, and eventually the child will figure out who they are. They might, like Sarah was saying, they might wind up just kind of having a fluid identity, and really being able to validate that that's who they feel like that day, and that's okay. I think that that's the best way.
Thank you both. So I think we've come to the end of our extended time today. Thank you, Dr. Stevens and Dr. Bruce, for joining us and sharing your expertise with us this morning. I do think that we're probably due to do some more on this topic in the coming months. Reminder that this presentation has been recorded, and we'll let you all know when it's available to view and share with your colleagues and friends. If there are any questions that we were not able to get to today, and there are, we will share some of those with all of you in a follow-up email as well. Please save the date for our next webcast, which is scheduled for January 26th, 2022, believe it or not, at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, in which we will share information about best practices in education for students with high needs. We will reach out to you further with information as it becomes available. At the Help Group, we always endeavor to provide the best education to our students and to impart what we have learned about best practices to parents, other schools, and other communities. If you would like to learn more about our schools and programs, you can go to our website at www.thehelpgroup.org. Email our admissions department at admissions@thehelpgroup.org. Or if you have a phone, you can even call us at 877-943-5747. You may also learn more about our Kaleidoscope program at www.kaleidoscopelgbtq.org. Life hack, if you don't know how to spell kaleidoscope, if you're like me, kale, that lovely lettuce, kale, ID, like your driver's license, oscope, lgbtq.org.
I do it as kale, I do scope.
Oh, I like that better. Kale, I do scope. And now you can spell kaleidoscope. So if you learned anything from this, that's that. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your choosing to spend your valuable time with us today. We at the Help Group are here for you when you need us. Have a great rest of your day.